very much for coming. I know you all want to be here because you had to wait for the elevator, so thank you very much. I'm going to talk today about communication anti-patterns. And this is going to be based on a lot of the experiences that I've had over the past couple of years, working in teams, both teams in one location and in a distributed team as well. I'm a developer at ThoughtWorks. I haven't always been a developer. So some of this as well is based on experiences that I've had working in different workplaces. So to start, I'd like to thank the sponsors and everyone for making this conference possible. And to start with a question that is something we like to ask ourselves a lot on our team, which is how do we get better at delivering quality software? And we try a lot of different things, and most of the things we try are technical. So we do pair programming, we refactor, we do test-driven development. We try and understand what's happening in the technology landscape, what are the best new practices that we can be implementing. We do continuous integration, we do continuous deployment. But this doesn't get us exactly when we want to get us. We still find that we have problems in our team, problems delivering quality software, problems meeting the expectations of our stakeholders. And one of the things we struggle with is how do we get the information where we need to get it at the right time? And so one of the things we were thinking about is when we want to get better at delivering quality software, we go to Agile. We look at kind of these fundamental principles of what is software development about. And one of the things I want to highlight here is that Agile has at its core the value that individuals and interactions are what's really, really important in developing software. Obviously, the technical skills are important. Obviously, your processes and your tools and how you develop software is really important. But what's key is how you work together as a team and how you interact with different people. Which kind of led us to the conclusion that it's not enough just to focus on the technical practices that we do. Effective communication is really what's important. Effective communication helps us get us where we need to because we use it every day. So we use it when we're talking to our business stakeholders to understand what product features they want and what that actually means in terms of working code. We use it when we're working together as a team, when we're pairing, when we're talking about implementation, when we're trying to understand the problems. And crucially, we use it when we're trying to learn and improve how we work. So the very way we express the problems that we're facing needs really effective communication. And if you don't believe me, believe Uncle Bob. So Uncle Bob here says in the Agile Software Development book that actually working well with other people, communicating, is more important than raw programming talent, which is kind of counterintuitive and is not the message we always get. We're told to focus on technical skills, being technically excellent, but actually sometimes we miss this. And he goes even further. He says you can be kind of an okay average programmer, and as a team, you can do better than a team of rockstar programmers if you know well how to communicate well between each other. So for me, this just highlights how important it is to really do this well. But the next question, how? So maybe you're all with me so far. Maybe you're like, yeah, get that communication is important. We've already got this. But the problem is, it's actually really hard to work out exactly what's going wrong with communication and how to fix it. One thing that we talk about, especially working on a remote team, is we need to communicate more. But that doesn't help us, because what does communicating more actually mean? So the way I started thinking about this was, if we want to know what good looks like, maybe we should try and work out what does bad actually look like. And there's a really useful way of approaching this, which is to use anti-patterns. So anti-patterns is a concept we're kind of familiar with from software development already. There's a lot that's been written on design anti-patterns. You can read the refactoring book, and it will give you a list of design anti-patterns, so code smells. And this is really handy because it helps us identify things that go wrong often, again and again. It's something that you'll have seen before. This particular code smell is something that you know about, and it gives us a way of talking about it. So if I say something about shotgun surgery, you might already know what I mean because that's an anti-pattern that you've come across. So shotgun surgery is when you try and change one thing in the code and you find out that you're having to change it in 20 other places because the code's really coupled together. So having these really handy concepts are really good for being able to identify problems and common bad practices that we see. And this helps us because it gives a solution. You see this problem, you already know what the solution might be. You can begin to understand how to fix it. But it goes further than that because anti-patterns can also lead you to what the underlying problems are. And this is something that I want to get to once we've explored the Antipatterns a bit, to try and understand, like, what is this actually telling us? So, to start, I'm going to go through some common ones that I've seen, some examples of them, what the impact they have, and how you can start to solve them. And I'll have a lot of these amazing glyph designs, which if you've ever seen a ThoughtWorks presentation before, you've probably seen these before. So the first one I want to talk about is using the wrong tools or using tools the wrong way. So an example of this that is particularly frustrating is when we use email for everything, communicating in a software development team. It's hard, information gets lost, and people don't answer emails as quickly as you want them to. So you end up waiting on this response to this email when actually you just want to be writing the code. And then we had chat applications, and that made everything great, right? Not so much. So they're good if you use them in the right way, but sometimes we see really bad examples of fractured communication. So one person is having a private conversation with someone else on Slack, another person is having a private conversation with someone else, and maybe that could be fixed if you all just kind of wrote in the same channel, but then there's 10 different channels that you're looking on. So we don't always use these applications in a really helpful way. Another thing that I've experienced a lot doing remote collaboration is the pain of trying to set up video conferences. We had a meeting once that was supposed to last half an hour, and we spent 25 minutes trying to set up the video connection. Obviously, we didn't end up having the meeting, and that was a waste of everyone's time, so it's really frustrating. And another thing, you get a lot of noise, especially sometimes on Slack, on anything that makes communication really easy. People write a lot. People tell you a lot of things. You get a lot of information coming through. We have a channel that has a lot of Git hooks added into it, so every time anyone commits anything, you get a notification. That's useful, but it's also noise. Like, you stop paying attention to the important things. And this can be a real problem. So one of the biggest things I see, particularly in using email for everything, is you lose information. It's hard to write out the details of everything in an email, so you don't, right? Like, you write the most important stuff, but maybe you miss out some details, but maybe those details are really important, so it's frustrating, and you miss this, and it causes problems. And it's hard to develop this shared understanding because not everyone has access to the same information at the same point in time to look through it together. And you miss really important things. So a good example of this is with alerting. So we have a lot of alerts set up, and before, some of the thresholds for those alerts were too low. So we got loads and loads of alerts. And you know that actually they're not important because they're just things that kind of are happening standardly in the application. It doesn't mean that everything's down. But one of those alerts probably does mean that everything's down. But because we kind of stop paying attention to them, we miss that. And that's a real problem. If you don't notice the important things when they're happening, that's a big issue. But there's things you can do. So the Agile practices talk a lot about how face-to-face is the best form of communication between software development teams. And I get that, and I agree. And the reason is because it's really high bandwidth communication, which means you can communicate a lot of things quickly and effectively. Sometimes that's verbal communication, but it's also non-verbal communication as well. Like, you get a lot from someone, being able to see their face, being able to see the way they interact with you. But when I say face-to-face, I do think video conferencing can work with this. But it's important to have the right tools. So with video conferencing, sometimes you have to struggle to find something that works. We did this. We had to struggle to find what a good communication technology is that worked for both us and our partners on the other side. But we did find that. And now we're really proactive about saying, nope, let's use this. We know this works. This is the only thing that works a lot of the time. And maybe you have to invest in something, but that investment is worth it because of the time you save, because of the energy you save, being able to have the communication you need to. And I think it's also important to remember simplicity here. Like, there's so many different channels of communication sometimes. Information gets lost in different ones. So keep it as simple as possible. Try and keep your channels of communication down to as few as is reasonably possible to communicate information. So, moving on to the next pattern, speaking different languages. And by this, I don't quite mean speaking English or speaking Spanish. I mean when we're communicating in ways that are fundamentally different. The biggest example I see of this is when we as developers talk about things in really technical terms and business stakeholders don't understand what we're talking about. So say we're talking about a problem in terms of the HTTP status codes and it's returning a 403, but should it be returning a 500? A business stakeholder might not have any idea what we really mean by that. And that's a problem, right? If they don't understand the context of the conversation, they don't understand how important this is at a business level. And another thing that can often happen, and this is more of a language thing, is people might use a lot of cultural references or a lot of idioms in the way we speak. I'm definitely guilty of this as a native English speaker. I use phrases that are immediately obvious to me that I forget that aren't obvious to people who are learning English as a second language. Learning another language has helped me a lot with this, so I would recommend you do that. And another thing that's kind of related to both of these is often we use meaning that's implicit, not explicit. So we use things that are kind of pointers to meaning, and we expect everyone to be aware of those references, but often they're not. And that's a problem because people don't actually understand what we mean, even if we think they do. So the impact of this, particularly around speaking different technical and business languages, is we're not really sure of what work adds the most value. Our business stakeholders can't tell us because they don't understand the nature of the problem, and we can't tell them if we don't understand the nature of the business. It also means that people often will be working off a different set of assumptions. Maybe I think you mean one thing and someone else thinks you mean another thing. This can cause real problems. So I read a story about a major project that essentially ran aground because of a different interpretation of one single word between native English speakers and non-native English speakers. And they didn't say what that word was because it was too obvious from the domain language what company it would have been, so they didn't say. But I found that fascinating, that something as simple as the meaning of one word can actually derail a huge project. And another thing that I think can happen that's maybe a bit more subtle is there's a kind of us versus them mindset that can develop. Sometimes we talk about having tribes in software development. We have, the team should be a tribe, it should be really well bonded. But this can be a problem if it means that you have all these implicit references, you have this language that you use that other people don't understand and excludes other people. And whilst I think it can be great to have that cohesion together, to have that sense of shared purpose, we have to be aware of who it's excluding. Is that excluding our business stakeholders? Is that excluding other people who don't look and sound and think exactly the same way we do? So it's really important to be aware of. And there's things you can do. So the most obvious, I think, is anyone in a technical role understanding the business language that stakeholders are using. So understand what's really adding value to their business, what's really driving revenue for their business, what are the key domain terms in the domain that you're working in. But also help business stakeholders understand technical concepts as well. Not all of them, but like high-level technical concepts or the key things that you need to refer to a lot. Help them understand those, help explain what that means in simple language. That can really, really help develop this shared understanding. And a great example of when this works is I had a product owner say to me the other day, I asked, oh, do you know how we make this change? And I was expecting a sort of, oh, go talk to this team and maybe they can help you. And she said immediately, oh, yeah, you just do a pull request to this repository here. And I was like, that's great. That's exactly what I needed to know. But it's also great that she understands enough about those technical concepts to be able to communicate that really efficiently. And the last point here is about making meaning explicit and clear. Don't say something indirectly if you could just say it directly. Even if maybe it seems easier to say it indirectly, it's important to be absolutely clear about what we mean. So the next one I want to talk about is one that I think I've struggled with most recently on a team, is we don't always proactively share knowledge or really reflect on what we do. And kind of symptoms of this can be knowledge silos. So maybe you had one person implementing a particular feature of the code, but they didn't proactively go back to the team and explain exactly how that worked and what happened. And maybe that person leaves the team. That happened to us, and we now have this piece of code that we don't really understand fully because we never had that explanation. And another thing that can happen is that thing that we don't talk about in the team. Like that problem that everyone knows is there, but none of us talk about, none of us want to tackle and deal with. I can see some of you smiling, so I'm guessing I'm not the only one that's experienced this. But it can be really difficult, and it can create an atmosphere that's horrible to work in. And sometimes not sharing useful observations can be a problem. So I've had meetings before where people are talking, and the people talking in the meeting are the people that normally talk in the meeting. So maybe the louder people. And then after the meeting, I'm talking with one of my other colleagues, and they mention a really important point and observation that they had that they didn't mention in the meeting, but that's actually really critical and might have completely changed the discussion that we had. And that's really important to share. And sometimes the reasons for not wanting to share it can be a lot of different things, but often it's feeling that maybe that's not an important observation. Maybe people don't need to know this. Sharing more, people can filter out what they need to know, but it is kind of important to kind of reflect on these things. So the impact that I see, especially with knowledge silos, is you get an increased bus factor. So the bus factor is a measure of the resilience of a team because it describes how many members of the team could get hit by a bus and this team still manage to effectively function. Obviously, we hope no one gets hit by a bus, but it's a useful way of thinking about how resilient is my team. If one person leaves, can my team still go on working? If two people leave, can my team still go on working? You obviously want this number to be as high as possible because it means that the team can cope with change, they can cope with unexpected situations. But if there's a knowledge silo and that one person leaves the team, that's a problem, right? That can be a real issue. And the problem with not talking about bad things is that bad things get worse. Bad things don't get better if you ignore them and don't talk about them. And the effect that it can have on a team in terms of the working atmosphere, the hostility, the environment is huge. And maybe they're difficult things to talk about. Like, we avoid these things if they're difficult personal problems, if they're difficult issues with particular people, but talking about them really helps. It's the only way to get to a solution. And if we don't proactively share knowledge and reflect on what's working, we can't make improvements because the only way to make improvements is to identify problems and identify ways to fix them. So that's kind of the remedy, is get into this habit of knowledge sharing, get into this habit of saying, oh, I did this, I'm going to explain to people. And maybe that starts in a kind of artificial way at first. So we have knowledge sharing sessions once a week. And when you first set up that meeting and maybe no one wants to share anything, it feels awkward and it feels weird. But as soon as people kind of start sharing topics, it becomes more comfortable, it becomes more natural. And then it becomes a really obvious and natural thing to do in the life cycle of the team. And confront difficult topics, talk about them. If there's something really difficult, find effective ways to get around that, to go through that, and to broach that with the whole team. It's hard, but it's really worth it. Another thing that we do a lot that helps is pair programming. So pair programming between developers helps share technical knowledge, but actually also pairing with business stakeholders can be really helpful. So maybe pair with a business stakeholder on writing a user story to understand how to write it, to give technical input into that user story and understand more about the business context. That can be really helpful in developing this shared language, this shared understanding. And another thing that we kind of do a lot at ThoughtWorks is develop this focus on mentoring and coaching. So expecting more senior people to be able to coach more junior people. So to proactively help lead them to knowledge acquisition, to help understand, like, what are the concepts you need to know about now? What is the most effective way that I can help you understand that concept? Having that mindset and thinking about that often can really help spread knowledge in the team effectively. So this is kind of what I'm trying to get to now, is a lot of the things that we've been talking about. You can think about communication as how well information is flowing. So there's a guy called Robert Westrom who had these three typologies of organizations based on what their culture was like. And he said a lot of it would get down to the culture would determine how well information flowed through the organization. And some of the characteristics of good information flow was that it provides answers to the questions that need to be answered. So it's useful. It's timely. You get the information at the right time when you need it. And it can be presented in a way that can be effectively used. These are really important because some of the anti-patterns I've just been talking about, the real problems that they are is that one of these things is not happening. So if we're speaking different languages, if we're explaining things in a technical way to someone who's more business orientated, they can't use that information because they don't know what it means. And maybe we're not even answering the questions that they want answered in the first place. And timely as well. This is where communication tools are really important because they help you get that timely communication, synchronous communication, not asynchronous communication. All of which leads me on to the last anti-pattern that I want to talk about that I think is really important. And that's when we see communication as a soft skill. So some examples of this that I see a lot is all communication in the team is done by one or two people. And maybe this is like a business analyst or a product owner. But they are the only ones doing the communication. So they're the ones writing emails, writing user stories, facilitating all the different meetings, trying to kind of proactively send out information. And that can be a problem. And some of this, I think, is done because of this second thing that I see a lot, which is we think of communication as a talent. So you're either good at communicating or you're not good at communicating, and that's it. And if you're not good at communicating, you don't need to be not good at that's okay, because I'm a developer, why do I need to communicate? And so you don't improve it. So we don't focus on the things that we could be getting better at. And the impact here is you increase your bust factor again. If there's one person on the team that's doing all the communication, if they go, the team can't effectively function. We don't think about it in this way. Maybe it's more intuitive to think about that in technical skills, but it's really important here as well. And it makes it harder to solve these communication problems that we perceive, that we know that they're there, but we can't talk about them because we don't understand enough about the language to talk about them, about what kind of things there are. And it means that there are fewer opportunities for personal growth. Being able to communicate clearly has a lot of benefit outside of software development. It's a really useful skill, and it's a really important skill, and it can enrich your life in a lot of different ways. And if we don't focus on that in work, where we spend most of our time, we're losing a real opportunity to develop ourselves in really interesting ways. So one of the remedies is recognizing that communication is hard. Being a good communication isn't easy, but you can get better at it in the same way you can get better at any other technical skill is by practice and reflection. So understand what good communication looks like. Find people who are good communicators and understand what they're doing that makes communication good. And when I talk about good communication here, I want to go back to the concept of information flow. So good communication is good information flow. That doesn't mean you have to be really charismatic and use lots of flowery language. That's not always helpful. Some of the best communicators I've seen are very, very efficient communicators. So they get the meaning across in as fewer words as possible. And I think that's a really good kind of principle to think about. Communication is not about using lots of words, having a really advanced vocabulary. Communication is getting the right information to the right place at the right time in a way that people can understand it. And if you one of the things that can help with this is having a growth mindset. So having this idea that actually these kind of things are not talents that are fixed. I can influence my ability to communicate by really thinking and focusing on it. And an easy way to do that in a team is sharing responsibility for communication. So if you haven't facilitated a meeting, facilitate a meeting. Maybe it's really difficult the first time, but you learn a lot doing that. And practice writing, practice talking in different formats, talking in meetings, even doing presentations. All of that can help develop these skills and develop an understanding of what good and bad communication looks like. And focus on information flow as well. Like, that's the easiest place to start. Think about this from a technical perspective of what is the best way for me to get the meaning and information across to the people that I'm trying to communicate to. So we've talked about what bad looks like, and we've talked a bit about what good looks like in terms of what those solutions are. But I kind of want to go a bit further. So having anti-patterns is useful, but what's more useful is having patterns, particularly since it's important to recognize that the way communication happens in a team often reflects the way communication happens at an organizational level. If you're working with an organization where information is not effectively shared, it's really hard to drive that change from a team level. And what can really help is having frameworks for doing that. So the context of a pattern is kind of the opposite of an anti-pattern, right? It's a recurring solution rather than a recurring problem. And it's also contextual as well. So we know what the pattern looks like, and we know the kind of the situation in which it can be used effectively. And these are developed into the concept of a pattern language. So there was an architect called Christopher Alexander who came up with the concept of pattern languages. And a pattern language is a collection of patterns, and it describes not only the patterns, but the relations between them. So one pattern might be dependent on another pattern and might imply a different pattern. And the relations of all of these together develops into a pattern language. And this is used in software development as well. We build different pattern languages to help describe a series of practices that we use. So an example of this is Scrum. So Scrum can be described as a pattern language. And it's hard to kind of see all of the things here, but you can see a couple of them. So things like the pattern of team pride is closely related to the pattern of group validation. One is dependent on the other. And you can see like these things form really complex networks, really interesting intersections of ideas. But mapping it out in this way is really helpful because you can show this to someone and you can explain the patterns to them and show them how these things are complex and interact together and help start building a better framework for understanding and implementing these things. And this is another example that I found really interesting, which is different flavors of Agile. So each of the different tube tracks are different variations of Agile. So the pink one here is extreme programming, the red one here is Scrum, the blue one is testing. And it describes not only the main patterns, but also the intersections between them as well. So pair programming is really important for teams, but also it's a key feature of XP. And I like thinking about these things in different ways, because if we were to develop a pattern language for communication, there'd be a lot of intersection with these patterns already that exist in Agile. And I think it's really interesting to think about adding to it in that way, thinking, what's a communication pattern that we really need to start describing that can link into all these different things? So this is kind of where I think, this is my kind of final thought of how do you actually start doing this in a team? And I think the first thing you can do is identify your anti-patterns. And they're different for each team, right? Maybe you experience some of the things you're describing. Maybe you have different problems that I haven't described here. But start talking about them as anti-patterns. Start identifying things that are happening. And crucially, identify the impact on the team as well. Because it's a lot easier to get traction for changing these things if you can identify the problem that it's actually causing you. Step 2, experiment. So I've suggested some solutions here. Some of them might work for you, some of them might not work for you, and some of them might take a while to get right and different variations of them. So like anything that we do when we're developing software, try something, see what happens, see if it works, see what works often, what works in a recurring situation, and what works only in some contexts. And step 3, learn and share it. So what I think can be really helpful here is when we all start talking more about what good communication looks like, and we start developing a language, and we start developing a vocabulary for talking about this. And I like, that's a kind of really meta point, having a language for talking about a language, like communicating through communication. But I think there's a lot of like interesting space to go into to really understand how we can talk about communication better in software development teams. And I think one of it is talking about it more. Like, this is a thing that we don't always recognize as one of the main things holding us back, but I think is something we can all learn from. And yeah, that's everything. Thank you very much for listening. And I'd really welcome your questions. And also, I'd really welcome the experiences you've had. So what are the kind of anti-patterns you've seen? And maybe what have you done to try and solve those?
Hi, good talk. Thank you. So I was wondering if you have any recommendation for specific materials or way to improve communication. I mean, I mean myself finding my shortage on this skill set, and I found it really hard to find something actionable apart from just trying to write more and do reviews with some people. So some more specific like books, tutorials, something like to train this up.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that I can think of. So if you want to get a really high-level idea of what good communication looks like, particularly written communication, George Orwell has 6 fundamental rules for writing. And just Google those and they'll come up. They're really helpful because a lot of what they talk about is simplicity, but they're a really good place to start in terms of identifying what good looks like. And they're things that you can apply when you're writing and thinking. Other things that I think are helpful is understanding about nonviolent communication. So this is a concept in communication that can help you understand better how to communicate in an effective way. And it really goes into kind of what you're saying, like what your needs and motivations are behind things, and making that meaning explicit a lot of the time. But it's a really good book that I definitely recommend. And in terms of kind of other things, I think reading is good, and trying to get these ideas of what good looks like is helpful. But I think the way to really improve is by practicing and implementing them. And getting feedback from people is really crucial as well. So practice doing things like practice writing, practice talking, practice giving presentations, and then ask people what they think worked and what they think didn't work so well. In particular, if you can find people that you think are really good communicators that are really good, ask them, because they probably have a really interesting perspective on this.
Thank you.
Hi. In my company, we were told once regarding the communication between IT and business that IT should do the effort to communicate to business because business was the preferred language instead of IT language. Do you agree with this? Do you think it's better to set a midpoint, or for IT people to make the effort and make the language more business-like?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think I partially agree that business should be the main language. So the reason I think that is because it's ultimately what drives how useful the software we create is. So if our software is not adding value to users, if it's not adding value to the business, it's not useful software. Like, why are we doing it? Why are we expending this effort in building it? And the way to understand this is the way to be able to articulate that value is using business language. So for that reason, I think it's really important that developers learn to speak this. But I also think it is really important for everyone to be more technologically literate, to be able to understand technological concepts. In a business, that's really important because it's very easy to kind of disregard important technical points if you don't really understand kind of how serious they are. And sometimes it's really hard to do that without some understanding of the technical concepts. And more generally in society, this is probably a meta point, but I think more generally, technology is impacting on so many different areas of our lives, but still for an awful lot of people, it's this black box, it's this magical space that they can't possibly know anything about. And that's simply not true. Like, anyone can learn the fundamentals of technology, some of these fundamental concepts. Anyone can learn to program. I learned to program only a few years ago. I did a different thing before, and it wasn't anything related to mathematics or computer science at all. So I really do believe that everyone can learn these technical concepts, and it's important to do that. Within the context of an organization, I think making that change happen is quite slow. And one of the most effective ways to make that change is by speaking business language in the first place, and then trying to influence people, trying to talk about these concepts, maybe trying to explain things that people maybe didn't ask for explained, but that you think are helpful. And identifying the most important things to understand is probably key to that as well. But I do think speaking the language of business is the first step to be able to do that.
Curiosity. How much time did you spend to prepare this presentation, these talks? How long have you... I suppose it's not the first time that you have this talk.
No, it's the first time I've given this talk, so... so I guess... I don't know, like, it's hard to quantify exactly how much time I've spent on it, but in actually kind of writing the presentation, a lot of these ideas were ideas that I already had because I've spent a lot of time thinking about this over the past however many months of kind of working in the team and seeing communication not working. And I think starting to refer to these things as communication anti-patterns is something that happened in a team retro about 3 or 4 months ago. So like this word and this concept appeared, and from then I kind of started thinking about like, oh, that's an interesting way of describing this problem. So yeah, that's kind of, I've been thinking about this for a long time in terms of actually kind of doing the slides and stuff. Like, I guess the past few weeks I've been working on it, but yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm thinking about all of these communication points and things and how to improve it. And since I think this is a lot about psychology of people, for example, I work in a very small company, and I think we have lots of communication problems, even if we are like a 10-people company. But I think it's like difficult to make people aware of that we have communication problems. So how would you start about this?
Yeah, I think it can be difficult to start to talk about if you're not used to talking about it, which is why I think like finding one specific thing to start with is really important. So if you think there are problems, try and find out what is the thing that frustrates you the most in your daily practice. What is the thing that you think creates the biggest problem for the team that you're working on? And start with that and start talking about that at a team level. So if you do retrospectives, bring it up in a retrospective. Bring it up when you're talking to other members of the team. And try to start building that shared understanding that this is a problem and this is a problem related to communication. And I can see what you're saying. From the context you're working in, we assume that communication things only go wrong when we're talking about large numbers of people across large distances. But that's not always true. They can happen with very few amounts of people. And when you think about it, that makes sense. Like, you can have communication problems between two people, in a relationship with two people. So it makes sense that they happen in all of these contexts. But I really think the starting point is like identifying something specific and identifying the pain it's causing you, because that's where you can kind of build traction for changing it. Starting small and working up from there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, one. Oh, sorry, did you have a question? Yeah. Oh, wait.
Hi. You've talked about communication in a remote team.
Mm-hmm.
So currently, my team is a remote team, and we would like to improve our communication.
Mm-hmm.
And well, do you have any tips for that? For example, I'm interested in how often do you go for video conferences? What kind of things you just type, and for what kind of things you go for a meeting?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So what we found that works for us in terms of we have daily stand-up every day is a meeting we have, and that's always via video conference. And actually we shifted this a bit because initially people were joining the video conference but didn't have their cameras turned on. And then at one point we said, actually, this is really important that we can see each other because that makes a huge difference. So something as simple as making sure everyone has their camera turned on in a daily stand-up meeting and you're all connected there face-to-face makes a huge difference. And we do all of our meetings remote. So say if we had a refinement session or a sprint planning session, we would do those remote as well. And the way we started doing them is we would all be individual. So the team that I was working in Barcelona would be dialing in from our desks and we'd have a camera each. But the team in the client site would all be dialing in from a meeting room. And that meant that we kind of lost a lot of information there because we couldn't always hear what people were saying in the meeting room and we couldn't see their faces and we couldn't see their body language. So we shifted it again. And now the preference is to have everyone dial in remote. So everyone dial in from their own computer and you get that face-to-face communication. So you can see when people are talking, you can see their eyes, you can see their facial expressions, and that makes a huge difference. And it makes it easier to empathize with people as well, which is kind of one of the underlying problems in distributed team is it's hard to empathize with people that are further away. But seeing them really helps do that and really helps develop it. So those were two things that we did that made a massive difference. And in terms of like when to write and when to use video conferencing, I think this is kind of a situation that we'd play by ear. So we're still kind of fine-tuning this. But whenever we were having a conversation on Slack that was taking kind of more than sort of 2 and 3 things to sort out, we'd say, let's have a call about this. Let's just all get together now, have a quick call, maybe 2 or 3 people, and talk about this and sort out what we think the right thing to do is. And we also try to use pairing a lot as well. So pairing over video is really tricky since there aren't any great tools for it anymore. But we kind of stuck with the pain and we kind of really pushed through to make it work because it makes a massive difference. It makes it so much easier to share implementation details, to share your thinking about something, which is something that doesn't come across in the code always. Even like with well-written tests, well-written code, the reasons why someone made a decision, you can only get that by talking to them and by coding with them. So those would be my top tips. Make sure everyone is dialing in for video conferences face-to-face and make sure these meetings happen at least once a day and try and pair as much as possible to get that high bandwidth face-to-face communication.
Hi. You suggested that synchronous communication is better than asynchronous, right? And we completely agree. However, there is a point in which if every information exchange that you do is synchronous, I have seen situations in which people say, I can't get 30 minutes of straight work because I can interrupt the whole time. Maybe you are under the pressure of delivering something, or the size of the team change, and there is more workload. What is the limit between one thing or the other? Or is it always good to have synchronous communication, and the problem is not really in the fact that the communication is synchronous. The problem is somewhere else, and you have to fix it somewhere else.
Yeah, I think I would probably say the second point. So I think synchronous communication is important, where it's communication about the things that you're working on. So that information is important to receive if it's going to change what you're programming on right now, right? Like, you need to know that information. If it's information that's not relevant to that, that's not going to change anything, is not something you need to know, then you don't need to receive it synchronously. So I think the question really to be answered is, like, what is being communicated and how often. Communication between developers should be happening all the time, and that's what makes delivering software effective. But it's not always the case that communication needs to happen if we're talking about higher level things around teams and projects and processes. That's something that you don't need to receive every minute, every hour. So if that's the kind of information that's being communicated, maybe there are better mediums for all that. So when I said don't use email, I didn't mean don't use email for everything. Sometimes email is an appropriate medium of communication because it's easy to go out to everyone and it's something that's easily on record, it's searchable, you can go back and find that email. That kind of stuff's important to see. And if it's just general contextual information, having it on a Confluence page or whatever kind of wiki you're using for storing information that's then searchable, that's information that should go there and shouldn't live in something like a chat application. So I think kind of really understanding like what information is getting communicated at what time is kind of key for resolving that. But as well, sometimes you need to build in blocks. Like this for us is a challenge that we also faced in working in a remote team, is that we didn't have time to just sit down and focus on developing. And sometimes you need that space, you need that time. So sometimes you have to make it really clear that you need that. But an effective way of doing that is communicating that, is saying to stakeholders, I'm going to work on this problem. I am going to be focused on this problem for the next X amount of time. Like if something's really urgent, obviously let me know, but otherwise don't expect me to respond in the next 2 hours because I'm just going to be focused on this. And that can help as well. That can help people to understand, do they need to tell you this information right now, or is it something that can definitely wait for a couple of hours? So I think there's never an answer as to whether asynchronous or synchronous is going to be best, because it depends on context. So understanding what information is being communicated and why.
Thank you.
Hi. In my short experience of consulting, I've encountered many of this with the end clients, and sometimes it seems to me that they are mostly driven through based basically from the culture and sometimes some fears. The most apparent one that I've encountered is, for example, a blame culture, where people fear being blamed of something. Then many of these dysfunctions appear based on that. Have you experienced something similar, and what's your understanding on the consequences of culture and fears in the team that go to this?
So I think that's a really interesting point. One thing that was interesting in helping to understand this, so I talked before about Westrum having these 3 typologies of organization based on information flow. And what you're describes one of the ones he's talking about, which is the kind of worst system for communicating information, but it's one where things are driven by fear and people retain information for political purpose because information is power. I have definitely worked in organizations like that, thankfully not currently, but in the past I have, and it makes a huge difference because people are not comfortable talking about the difficult things because they are afraid of blame and they don't speak truth to the people that need to hear the truth. In terms of kind of how to change that, I think it's really difficult because it needs to happen at an organizational level, and it's hard to drive that at the level of the team. I think teams can help with that by providing examples of what good communication looks like, and by sharing that with the rest of the organization and sharing what worked for them, what's important, and really starting to challenge some of those fundamental parts of the culture. But it's also really tricky because sometimes organizations won't change unless it's driven from the top. I think what's really interesting about the 3 typologies of organizations is in the generative organizations that are good at communication, information flow is driven by the mission. So the mission of the organization is what everyone's working towards. And the idea is you communicate the information that you need whenever you need to whoever you need to in order to fulfill that mission. So when people are focused on that, communication gets easier because that's what's driving everyone. But when communication is focused on retaining power and dealing with difficult situations and difficult people and fear, it makes it really, really hard. And I don't have an easy answer for how to change that. But I do think even within a team, even within a small group of people, building a shared understanding of why information is important can help kind of provide an example that can help maybe change other people's minds.
So I'm sorry, I'm going to add another question on top of that, because it was very interesting what you said of driving from the mission point of view. So do you think these lasting changes require good leadership for that to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think it's really difficult because it's not enough to say this organization has a mission and we all need to follow it. Really kind of getting people to buy into that, especially if that's not the way an organization has worked before, is really, really difficult. I know some of the places that I've worked before, so I worked in a university, and there were so many different conflicting missions from different parts of the organization, even saying that this was an organization that was driven by this mission, which is obviously something they did say, didn't mean that that was reflected in the reality of it. And what's needed to make that happen is someone that's able to like really convince people that this is a way of doing things. But I think what helps as well is people understanding that, people understanding what good looks like in terms of organizations and organizational structures, and having that kind of common understanding of that. That's what's missing a lot of the time. How to build that in large organizations through leadership is still something I'm trying to work out, but I'll let you know if I have any insights.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much.